Operation Paperclip. Okay, when you first hear that name, it sounds almost, well, mundane, doesn't it?
Yeah, like maybe some kind of office organization system filing project.
But hold on, because the reality behind that name is, frankly, staggering.
It really is.
We're talking about a post-World War II U.S. government operation that secretly brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, technicians, people from Nazi Germany over to the States.
1,600, that's a significant number.
It is. And here's the kicker. These individuals, many with, let's say, very complicated pasts under the Third Reich, they became absolutely instrumental in building the U.S. space program.
The very architects in many cases.
How on earth did that happen? How did minds working for the Nazi regime end up, pointing America towards the moon? That's the story we're diving into.
And it starts really with the immediate post-war situation. Think about it. World War II ends. The Cold War basically begins.
Right. The lines are drawn pretty quickly.
And the U.S. realizes very fast that technological superiority is going to be key, especially against the Soviet Union.
And they needed an edge?
They desperately needed it. And they knew German scientists had, well, incredible expertise, particularly in rocketry, that the U.S. just didn't have at that point.
So it was urgent, even before the war in the Pacific was fully over.
Oh, yes. The thinking was already happening. They saw this pool of knowledge in missiles, aerodynamics, other areas. And, well, there was even this initial idea of it being a kind of intellectual reparations.
Intellectual reparations.
Yeah.
That's an interesting framing.
It is, isn't it? A way to leverage German know-how, perhaps, as some form of payback, but mostly it was strategic. Get these scientists before the Soviets or anyone else could.
Prevent them falling into the wrong hands from the U.S. perspective.
Exactly. And the scale, again, 1,500 to 1,600 people between 1945 and 1959, it just underlines how vital this was seen to be.
And the name changes. Operation Overcast first, then Paperclip.
Yeah, that sort of suggests they knew it was sensitive, right? Overcast sounds a bit clandestine. Paperclip sounds, well, bureaucratic, almost deliberately bland.
Because of the paperclips used on the files, apparently.
That's the story. Attaching the vetted or maybe selectively vetted paperwork for these scientists, it hints at the secrecy, the ethical tightrope they were walking from day one.
And we need to be clear, these weren't just random engineers. We're talking about major players from the Nazi system.
Absolutely. Let's start with the most famous name, Wernher von Braun.
The rocket guy.
The rocket guy. He led the V-2 rocket program for Nazi Germany. The V-2, the terror weapon launched against London, Antwerp.
A weapon responsible for thousands of deaths.
Yes. And then, almost seamlessly, he transitions to become a leader in the U.S. space program, director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, chief architect of the Saturn V.
The moon rocket.
The rocket that took Apollo to the moon. I mean, the jump from Nazi weapons developer to American space hero, it's jarring, to say the least.
It really is hard to reconcile. And he wasn't alone in making that jump.
Not at all. You had Walter Dornberger, another key figure in the V-2 program, who later worked for the U.S. Air Force and Bell Aircraft on guided missiles, even early space shuttle concepts.
Okay.
Then there's Arthur Rudolph, hugely important in the U.S. program, managed the Pershing missile development, crucial on the Saturn V project.
Right.
But his earlier role, production manager for the V-2s at Middlework.
Middlework. That's the underground factory.
The one that used horrific slave labor from concentration camps. Thousands died there building those rockets. Rudolph's direct involvement in managing that production, it raises deeply disturbing questions.
Questions about knowledge, complicity.
Exactly. What did he know? What did he oversee? It casts a very dark shadow over his later achievements.
It certainly makes you think about the cost of that technological leap.
Absolutely. Who paid the price? We also need to mention Kurt Davis.
Okay, who was he?
He became the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center, oversaw the launch facilities, the Saturn V launches, his past, V-weapons flight test director in Germany.
Another direct link back.
Yes, and Hubertus Strughold, often called the father of space medicine.
Space medicine. That sounds critical for astronauts.
Hugely. His work looked at how the human body reacts to spaceflight conditions, G-forces, lack of oxygen, radiation. Foundational research for keeping astronauts alive.
Vital work. So what exactly did Strughold research?
He did pioneering studies even before Paperclip really ramped up on the effects of high altitude, acceleration, the space environment itself. This knowledge was directly applied to designing life support systems, spacesuits, training protocols for Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. Essentially, the rulebook for human survival in space.
So without his contributions, those early missions might have been impossible, or at least far riskier.
That's a fair assessment. His work really laid the biomedical groundwork.
And there were others besides these sort of headline names.
Oh, definitely. People like Adolf Bussmann, an aerodynamics expert who came up with the idea of swept wings for aircraft, hugely important for high-speed flight.
Right. You see that on jets all the time.
Exactly. And Ernst Stollinger, who worked on rocket guidance systems, building on V2 tech, and also championed things like ion propulsion for long-term spaceflight.
So a wide range of expertise. But the key point is, many of these leading figures weren't just scientists caught up in the system, were they?
No, that's crucial. Many were dedicated Nazi Party members. Some, like von Braun, even held ranks in the SS or the SA. They were, intertwined with the ideology.
Which makes the decision to bring them over even more ethically loaded.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about knowledge. It was about overlooking or actively concealing their past actions and affiliations in pursuit of that knowledge.
Let's talk about that knowledge transfer then. The V2 seems like ground zero.
It really was. The V2 was revolutionary for its time. First, long-range ballistic missile, liquid-fueled, which gave it much more power and range than previous rockets.
Developed at Peenemünde, built at Middlework.
Correct. And as the Allies advanced, the U.S. military wasn't just after the hardware, the rockets themselves. They desperately wanted the brains behind the rockets.
The know-how.
The deep understanding. And von Braun and his core team, well, they made a calculated decision. They actively sought out the Americans to surrender to, bringing with them crates of documents, blueprints, calculations, even arranging for the capture of intact V2s.
It sounds like they saw the writing on the wall and wanted to continue their work just under new management.
There was definitely an element of that. Self-preservation, yes, but also a genuine desire to keep pushing rocket technology forward. And the U.S. was the place they saw that happening.
So this captured tech and personnel.
Yeah.
What happened next?
They were brought to the U.S., initially to places like Fort Bliss in Texas, then later concentrated at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. They immediately started analyzing the V2 hardware, conducting test launches at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico.
Using the actual captured rockets.
Yes, and modifying them. The V2 wasn't just copied. Its principles directly influenced the design of early American missiles, like the Redstone and the Jupiter. In fact, the very first U.S. launched object to reach outer space, the Bumper WAC in 1949, used a V2 as its first stage booster.
So it literally boosted the U.S. into the space age.
You could say that. Von Braun's group essentially became the core of the U.S. Army's missile development program.
Okay, so the V2 provided that initial technological jump. How did they build on that foundation to get towards, Apollo?
The key was that liquid propellant technology. People like Arthur Rudolph used their experience to refine engine designs, making them more powerful, more reliable. Ernst Stollinger adapted V2 guidance concepts for greater accuracy in U.S. missiles.
And it wasn't just rockets.
No, as we mentioned, Bussmann's work fed into aircraft design. Struckhold's medical research was essential for human flight, both atmospheric and eventually space. It was a broad transfer of advanced German engineering and science.
And concentrating them in places like Redstone Arsenal was key.
Absolutely. It created centers of excellence, hubs where this knowledge could be focused and developed rapidly. Fort Bliss and Redstone became the nerve centers for American rocketry, largely because these German scientists were relocated there.
So they provided the tech base, but how did that translate into the big space achievements we remember?
Well, von Braun, again, was central. He wasn't just an engineer. He became a public advocate for space exploration. He wrote articles, appeared on TV shows with Walt Disney, really selling the dream of space travel to the American public.
Making it seem achievable, exciting.
Exactly. And technically, his team's expertise, honed over years, was indispensable for developing the Saturn rockets. Without the Saturn V, there's no Apollo moon landing.
And the others played key roles too.
Absolutely. Kurt Debus, running the launch operations at Kennedy Space Center, he oversaw every single launch for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Talk about pressure.
Immense pressure.
Arthur Rudolph, managing the Saturn V project itself. Ernst Stollinger's guidance work was critical for early successes, like launching Explorer I, the first U.S. satellite, in response to Sputnik.
Right, Explorer I was crucial after Sputnik shocked the U.S.
It was. And Strughold's space medicine work underpinned the safety and success of every single astronaut mission. The fact that these paperclip scientists held such senior leadership positions within NASA speaks volumes about how much the U.S. government came to rely on them.
They weren't just advisors, they were in charge of critical parts of the program.
They were running major divisions. When NASA was formed in 1958, it was a huge step. Then, in 1960, von Braun's entire Army rocket team was transferred en masse to NASA.
The whole team.
Pretty much, that team became the nucleus of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. Von Braun was its first director, chief architect of Saturn V Debus, headed up launch operations, eventually Kennedy Space Center. Rudolph was project director for the Saturn V. Strughold became chief scientist for NASA's Aerospace Medical Division.
So the core of NASA's heavy lifting and launch capability came directly from this paperclip group.
In large part, yes, especially for the Moon program. Debus overseeing all 13 Saturn V launches, including Apollo 11. I mean, that's history right there. Transferring von Braun's whole established team was smart. They already knew how to work together. They had that collective expertise.
It undoubtedly sped things up. You can't just conjure that kind of team cohesion and knowledge overnight.
No way. It gave the U.S. a massive head start, or at least allowed it to catch up and eventually surpass the Soviets in the moon race. That expertise in large, complex rocket systems was absolutely foundational for meeting Kennedy's goal.
But this brings us back to the really uncomfortable part, the ethics. Recruiting Nazi Party members, SS officers, people potentially involved in war crimes.
This is the unavoidable, deeply troubling aspect of Operation Paperclip. The U.S. government made a conscious decision to prioritize perceived national security needs and technological advantage over holding these individuals accountable for their pasts.
Did they know the extent of the involvement, like with Rudolph and Middlework?
The level of knowledge varied, and over time, more came out. But certainly, officials involved in the recruitment knew about Nazi Party memberships, affiliations with the SS or SA. There were explicit directives like President Truman's initial order saying no ardent Nazis should be recruited.
But that was overridden or ignored.
It seems intelligence and military officials often found ways around it. They classified files, sanitized records, essentially whitewashed the scientists' histories to get them security clearances. The justification was always that their knowledge was too valuable to lose, especially to the Soviets.
The ends justify the means, basically.
That was the operating principle, it seems. But it led to huge ethical compromises and later significant public backlash and controversy when the full extent started to emerge, particularly from the 1970s onwards.
How did that play out?
Investigative journalists started digging, Congress held hearings, the Justice Department eventually created the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, specifically to track down Nazis hiding in the U.S., and some paperclip scientists came under scrutiny.
Were there consequences for any of them?
Yes, though much later. The most prominent case is probably Arthur Rudolph. In the 1980s, facing investigation by the OSI over his role at Middlework, he agreed to renounce his U.S. citizenship and return to Germany to avoid prosecution.
So decades after helping put Americans on the moon.
Decades later. And Hubertus Strughold also faced accusations regarding his potential knowledge of or involvement in horrific medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners during the war. While never formally prosecuted, the controversy led to the renaming of awards previously named in his honor, like the Space Medicine Association's Strughold Award.
It shows the long tail of these decisions, doesn't it? The ethical debts eventually come due.
They often do. It leaves this enduring question about that balance. National security versus moral responsibility. How far should a nation go?
Looking back then, what's the overall legacy? How should we view Operation Paperclip today?
Well, its impact on the U.S. space program and missile technology is undeniable. It was pivotal. You simply cannot tell the story of the U.S. space race, especially the Apollo program, without acknowledging the absolutely crucial role played by von Braun and his team.
The Saturn V, Explorer I, the KSC launch infrastructure.
All directly linked. The technological leap forward was immense. They shaped NASA's early culture and capabilities. The foundations they laid in rocketry, propulsion, guidance, even infrastructure, benefited the entire aerospace industry for decades.
But always with that shadow.
Always with that shadow. The legacy is inherently complex. It's a story of incredible scientific achievement intertwined with profound moral compromise. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how progress is sometimes made.
Of course, Paperclip wasn't the only factor in the space race success, was it?
Oh, absolutely not. It's important to have that perspective. The intense Cold War rivalry itself, the Sputnik moment, that provided immense political motivation and funding.
Right, the political will.
Crucial. And you had brilliant American scientists and engineers too. We shouldn't forget pioneers like Robert Goddard, whose early liquid fuel rocket work predated the Germans, even if it wasn't funded or recognized in the same way initially. Domestic innovation played a huge role.
And President Kennedy's specific commitment to the moon landing.
Yes, that focused national effort was massive. Plus, the very creation of NASA as a civilian agency provided the organizational structure needed to pull off something as complex as Apollo. So Paperclip was a massive accelerant, a provider of critical expertise, but it slotted into a larger picture of competition, funding, political will, and domestic talent.
So summing up, Operation Paperclip. It's this story of strategic necessity, incredible technological leaps forward, particularly in getting America to the moon.
Absolutely. Foundational expertise, key leadership, landmark achievements like Saturn V and Explorer I.
But inextricably linked to this deep ethical controversy over recruiting individuals with Nazi pasts, raising questions that still resonate today about science, security, and morality.
Exactly. That tension is at the heart of the Paperclip story. The debate about whether the ends justified the means continues.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? To what extent should a nation compromise its stated values for strategic gain? And what are the hidden long-term costs when it does? Something to definitely mull over.
It's a question with no easy answers, and it echoes through history in different contexts.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating, if unsettling, look at Operation Paperclip. Now, if this deep dive has grabbed your interest and you want to explore more stories like this, these complex intersections of history, science, ethics, power, then we'd love for you to join us over on our Bookshelf channel.
That's where we go even deeper into a whole range of subjects, pulling apart the sources and getting into the nitty-gritty.
So make sure you subscribe to the Bookshelf channel. Stay curious, keep exploring these intricate stories with us. Today's discussion really is just scratching the surface of how knowledge and power have shaped and continue to shape our world in often unexpected ways.